I kind of always end up feeling when I do these videos on a nonfiction book, I've become very aware of the gap between my ability to analyze and discuss fiction versus my ability to analyze and discuss nonfiction. And it's heavily, heavily slanted in favor of fiction. I'm so good at discussing fiction. And the stuff that I have to say when I read nonfiction is so much more often just like, yeah, well, that was a thing that I read, and I liked it or I didn't like it. Um, which is kind of ironic because I end up, I don't know, reading a lot more nonfiction. Anyway, I read this time a philosophy question mark theology anthropology book called Violence and the Sacred by Rene Girard. Violence and the Sacred is not the first Girard book that I've read, but it turns out I should have started with Violence and the Sacred. This is the book that he references it in some of his other books. He's like, oh, my earlier work in Violence and the Sacred. And I always thought, like, oh, well, if I'm reading this sort of like updated version of his theories and ideas, then, maybe I don't have to read the first book. Turns out I really needed to read the first book. Okay, so the broad idea of Girardianism. How do I break it down? This is one of those books where, like, I don't know. I feel like maybe I should have made notes before I just started talking here. It's a very academic topic. It's not one of these little fiction books that I like to read. So Girard is laying out a theory of human nature that is very, very audacious. And on the one hand, it's an interesting type of theory because on the one hand, he's making extremely out there, audacious claims, and on the other hand, he is giving us relatively limited evidence. And there's quite a lot of theories like this in academia, especially in literary theory. And the issue is, one would be tempted to say, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The problem is that because Girard is making a claim about ancient history and sort of the early, sort of murky depths of human origins, solid evidence for anything on the subject is very, very sorely lacking. And so, unless you're just going to say, well, you're not allowed to make claims about that type of thing, then you can't really have a particularly high evidentiary standard. Now, I'm willing to accept maybe you should take pretty much everything Girard says with a grain of salt, but I also think I have found that his theories have, I don't know, applications for understanding things that are otherwise a bit more difficult to understand. Okay, so without further ado, Rene Girard's theory is about a sort of primordial crisis that human communities face. One way that I've put this before, and people seem to have responded well to this explanation of things, is that Girard believes that human beings there's a human equivalent to like colony collapse disorder in bees. There's a thing that just sort of happens to human communities. You leave them alone long enough, and this will just happen to them, that causes a complete implosion of human society. If you leave people alone with each other for long enough, they will eventually, all of the sort of social bonds that they create, actually, it's precisely those social bonds that they create that will cause their society to come undone. It'll cause basically like a little mini apocalypse. And that's quite a claim. But that's not it. That's not the end of the claim. The claim really it goes a little bit further than that. It's not just that human beings have this equivalent of colony collapse disorder, but that we've actually found a cure to human colony collapse disorder. And that this curing this sort of violent implosion of society, is the role of religion. And that's his claim, is that there's this fear that's kind of baked in to religion. In particular, Girard thinks that this is the function that primitive religions serve, and that modern Abrahamic religions are a little bit different for him. Maybe we'll talk about why today. Maybe we'll save that for another time. And okay, if you're a good college graduate, lived up guy like myself, you'll have heard the terms primitive religion and him like explicitly saying that, oh, Christianity is separate from those primitive religions. It does a totally different thing, and you'll maybe have your back up a little bit. You'll be a little bit concerned. Um, I thought about this a lot while I was reading the book. Girard uses the term primitive a whole lot, and yeah, I guess it's worth talking about the term primitive before we move on. Uh, Primitive is a term that anthropology has really struggled to get away from, and so far, don't think I've ever encountered. Admittedly, I haven't really like looked that hard, but I don't think I've ever encountered a good alternative. The problem with this is that anthropologists certainly don't use the word primitive anymore, but they certainly haven't gotten away from the concept. Most of the words that they use instead are euphemisms. They're words that they're using instead. It's not like we've gotten rid of the concept of a primitive person. Okay, so then what is a primitive person? The idea is that you look at people who live in small scale, relatively simple societies, and that somehow these people are closer to human nature in some way than we are. That's the main idea behind the concept of a primitive, right? And honestly, I think that most people would not contest the claim that if a group of people is living in a relatively like small agrarian society where they like, I don't know, don't have access to modern technology, they personally know most of the people that they have economic interactions with, stuff like that. I think most people would agree that those people are in some way closer to human nature. And actually, if you undermine that claim, if you doubt it, if you basically say that, like, no, why should we think that these people are closer to some sort of like humanness than we moderns are, then it kind of messes up not just Girard's theory, but like a lot of anthropology and a lot of thinking about the past. Like, if you undermine that claim, it's very difficult for us to make any sorts of claims whatsoever about human origins and actual primitive people. Like, I guess what I'm saying is the concept of a primitive person, right, is someone who lives in a form of society that is like ancestral to, that is a sort of a simpler version of um, what human societies can be, right? And there are modern people who live in societies that anthropologists point to and say, okay, this is a primitive person. In the same way that biologists point to certain organisms and they say, although these organisms are from like a technical perspective equally evolved to everything else that is currently alive on Earth, these organisms are like primitive in the sense that they bear traits that are extremely similar to their ancient ancestors. I think the argument in anthropology is basically the same. That although, like, anyone who lives in the 21st century is in some sense like equally modern to everyone else, certain people are presumed to live in societies that are actually a lot more similar to the way that all people would have been living 50,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or whatever, before modern history. There are some problems with that claim. I'd really like to spend some time learning more and like sort of developing a perspective on the problems with this claim and the sort of alternatives. But for now, suffice it to say that certain anthropologists have rejected this paradigm. They've rejected the idea that we actually can. Certainly, most anthropologists would say that we cannot, in any sort of direct and simple way, just analogize primitives that exist in the 21st century to like our ancient ancestors, right? Okay, Gerard engages with relatively little of this, but that's a little bit of a preface. You know, I'm giving you the tools that you would need to tear down Rene Girard if you wanted to. Okay, his claim. His claim has implications for all sorts of different stuff, and it's very like once you get the basic idea, you can apply it to so many different things. And it's funny because it doesn't sound like it would be applicable to that many different things, but it totally is. Okay, so human colony collapse disorder. It goes like this, actually. It follows a pattern that Rene Girard calls mimetic violence. And part of the argument, it's sort of, this is another thing that gives me, makes me feel a little bit suspicious of Girard, but it's kind of inescapable that part of the, like, validness of the argument that Girard is making is that he can tell you a story that sounds kind of plausible. And that story involves something called mimetic violence. Mimetic violence is the origin of this, what I've been calling human colony collapse disorder. Mimetic violence goes like this. You do something bad to me, and so I do something bad to you. And we sort of go back and forth in this sort of tit for tat, and we escalate, right? And mimetic violence doesn't just involve two people going back and forth, right? Because both of us have social connections to the rest of the community. It is precisely the ties that we would typically use to protect ourselves that in this case makes mimetic violence worse. It spirals out of control. And those ties are what allows human society to exist at all. So the problem is that mimetic violence sort of hijacks those ties that allow society to exist at all, and it turns them into a problem for people. Basically, the way it works is this, right? You have this cycle of mimetic violence, and let's say one day it gets deadly, right? Either you kill me or I kill you. Once one of us is dead, the fact of our murder cries out to our friends, family, whatever, for revenge, and presumably people are going to honor those obligations. And then the mimetic violence sort of spreads. It goes from being two individuals that are fighting each other to two communities or families or whatever organizational block uh, organizes society. Those groups are going to fight each other. Furthermore, mimetic violence actually has this tendency to involve bystanders, if that makes sense. Like if um if the ties that bind together a community are sufficiently complex, and they almost certainly will be, there will be people who have mixed allegiances, right? And this is, first of all, really, really bad for the people who have mixed allegiances. Like, let's say, I kill you, and there's some guy who's like your brother, but he's also like my cousin or something. I don't know. That guy has a mixed allegiance here, right? And it's very bad for those people, but it also creates the potential for a two-sided conflict to become a three-sided conflict and then a four-sided conflict, and eventually you just have the full like unraveling of society, and you end up with situations where groups of people look at each other and they view, like, let's say we have one clan and another clan. My attitude towards this enemy clan is that I simply need to kill them because they are going to kill me if I don't eliminate them first. And in the worst case scenario, I look on like every other person in that way. So I find that to be quite a compelling claim. This idea that tit for tat violence can get out of control in a way that threatens to pull apart society. And you have to remember, if you find this kind of implausible, you have to remember that what we're talking about are people without like neither modern concepts of justice nor, more importantly, modern institutions of justice, right? If you do something bad to me, I cannot take you to court to get restitution. What I need to do is I need to personally take that restitution, whatever I deem necessary, right? And there's not necessarily a mechanism for us to all agree on what's necessary, right? Like, let's say maybe you destroy my house or something, and I'm like, oh, that makes me so mad, so I'm gonna take like half your herd of livestock. Well, there's no system in place that says, okay, one destroyed house equals half the herd of livestock. We make this transaction and then everything's done, right? If I come and I take your livestock and I say, this is because you destroyed my house, well, maybe a miracle will happen. Maybe you'll say, okay, fair enough, we're even now. But probably in your eyes, what I'm taking from you is not equal to what you have taken from me. We have this sort of different view on things. So it leads to a situation where now there's extra left over. There's like, I have a debt to you that you then need to satisfy, and back and forth and so on and so forth, right? And without something that kind of approximates a judicial system, you just kind of have this problem, right? Now, another thing that you can do, another off the top of my head, like another thing that could address this need in society would be like very strong cultural norms, right? Really strong cultural norms about like this crime equals this restitution equals that, whatever. But I think Girard would point out that if we're going to talk about human origins, obviously those cultural systems come from something. And I think it's most plausible to say that they come from a human attempt to address a problem. And obviously the problem must predate the solution. So we must imagine this problem sort of before the solution, right? The problem must have existed before the solution. Okay, so that's mimetic violence. That's kind of just the start of his argument, though, because Girard's argument is not Oh, he calls this. So mimetic violence is when I do something bad to you and you do something bad to me, and it sort of causes us to increasingly resemble one another. Like we basically end up being more and more similar while also like kind of hating each other. He also has other weird arguments about the way in which mimicry itself kind of leads to mimetic violence. Maybe we'll circle back to that later. But anyway, mimetic violence leads to what Girard calls the ritual crisis. Okay, the ritual crisis is this thing that I've previously called human colony collapse disorder. It's the situation where basically like all of society comes undone. And the reason he calls it the ritual crisis is because he believes that ultimately this crisis is solved by the invention of ritual. He believes that most religious rituals, certainly all sacrifice rituals, exist in order to prevent this human colony collapse disorder. He imagines, although he never quite describes it in terms that are fully convincing to me, but he imagines this resolution to the ritual crisis that occurs more or less spontaneously, in which you have all of these warring factions that increasingly resemble one another, and eventually, just through coincidence, very, very good luck, something like that, the anger of each person or of many, many different people from the community settles onto one individual. So instead of us all, this sort of like overlapping complex web of hatreds and enmity, all of that hatred lands on one person. And we can gather together, not because we like each other, but because of our mutual hatred for Greg. And we all come together. We take our vengeance on we kill the ever living fuck out of Greg, and then we experience as a community this coming together. Things have been restored through our killing Greg. Everyone has vented their hatred. We've located a scapegoat for our problems. We've blamed all this stuff that's happening on Greg. And by this point, I think a key thing to understand about the when sort of imagining the ritual crisis is that at this point I think people would be quite eager for an end to this. You know, it's not exactly that everyone needs to sort of logically blame Greg for each step of the crisis. It's just that if we can all agree that this is Greg's fault, then we can all collectively come together. We can punish Greg, and it'll finally be over. Gerard discusses in other texts, actually, he doesn't discuss it in this one, but he talks about the qualities that make someone a good candidate for this kind of scapegoating. And one thing that he says is that it's best for it to be a member of the community who is at the same time kind of not a member of the community. They obviously need to be a member of the community because we need to be able to like have access to them. They need to have ties to us that make it plausible that we could blame them for everything that they're doing. But we also want them to kind of not be a member of the community because we don't want to kill someone who's like a full member of the community, right? Someone who has brothers and parents and a whole clan that's going to get angry at us for doing this. No, we want some like social outcast, right? So hopefully Greg is like some shitty loser living on the edge of our village, no siblings, parents dead, whatever. Maybe they're like there's something that marks them out as different, like they're disabled or they have some sort of weird something going on. They just need to be an outsider, and we need to feasibly be able to blame them for all of our stuff. So this also explains some of the attitudes that we have in scapegoating. Like this is supposed to be where scapegoating kind of comes from, right? Is this attempt to take all the enmity of a community and settle it on the shoulders of one person, and then fully punish them, and then it actually works, right? Because all of the hatred actually goes away once we put it on Greg's shoulders and then, beat him to death or whatever. All right, time for me to have some life-saving Coca-Cola Zero before I continue this discussion. Delicious. The Ritual Crisis, brought to you by Coca-Cola Zero. Okay, anyway. Oh, yeah. So Girard believes that this ritual crisis is an actual event that happened in history. I think he's never super duper clear about his claims. He's a French philosopher. I think part of the reason he's not super duper clear is because if he made it like super duper clear, it would be easier to, I don't know, ridicule his ideas if you wanted to. Um, but yeah, he never really fully spells everything out in a way that I don't love. But I think if you asked him, if you nailed him to the floor and were like, Gerard, fucking tell me, do you think that this was one event, or do you think this was a thing that happened in many, many times and places? I think he'd probably tell you many times and places that this is just the sort of thing that happens to human communities from time to time. And every once in a while, you have a ritual crisis, and sometimes it pulls society apart and everybody dies. And sometimes it threatens to pull society apart, and then it doesn't because we find our Greg and we all blame him for all of our problems, and then it's all set aside. And when the miracle happens, when we find our Greg and finally beat him to death, he believes that it inevitably leads, I don't know if inevitably is the right word, but that it leads to the formation of ritual because people recognize that we just killed Greg, and then there's this period of unbelievable, like miraculous peace that comes upon us, right? And that in various ways, people think about this piece in all sorts of different ways, and that leads to sort of variation in ritual. Essentially, the the peace that settles over the community is attributed to the sacrificial victim. They are reinterpreted as some sort of semi-divine figure, that by sacrificing them, we've done something, we've cast kind of like a spell on ourselves. And that ritual is essentially an emerging practice where we attempt to recapture the magic of the actual original event in order to maintain peace in the community. Um, Girard points to all sorts of crazy evidence for this in the anthropological literature, which I I used to be really into anthropology, and now I'm only quite into it. And I understood the argument that he was making a lot of the time, but I was not able to like fully assess. I don't really have anything to like bring to you about the types of arguments that he's making. And also, unless you're really into like kinship structures, they're not especially super duper interesting arguments. He also just like a weird sort of side thing. He's very like anti-psychoanalysis. He claims that his theory explains a lot of the stuff that psychoanalysis attempts to explain, but does so much better. We should get into the implications of these theories for literature, because Girard seeks to explain lots and lots of literature, especially lots of um, ancient literature, in terms of the sacrificial crisis. He essentially thinks that some ancient literature that has been really puzzling, like especially ancient Greek literature, is puzzling because it records the events of the sacrificial crisis and or like rituals relating to it, right? He also thinks that some literature expresses anxieties and sort of thoughts and feelings about the sacrificial crisis and the ritual process for containing mimetic violence. And I actually find that part of the book to be extremely like interesting and elucidating. His argument in regards to literature is that ancient peoples, and by this I mean like the ancient Greeks, like people who are within history, like history has started, but they're like from a really long time ago. That ancient people, the people who produced this kind of weird ancient literature, they had a set of concerns that were imminently tied to the sacrificial crisis and to mimetic violence, and that they were expressing those concerns through literature. And that a big part, like a lot of the stuff that is kind of hard for us to understand in ancient literature, it's hard for us to understand because we don't have those same concerns. We have solved the problems of mimetic violence using I think what Gerard would call much, much better tools, such as the modern judicial system and also modern religion, which Gerard views as doing what I guess I shouldn't say modern religion, Abrahamic religion, which Gerard views as inaugurating a new sort of attitude towards this whole process. He doesn't actually get into his discussion of Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions in this book so much, but the short version is that Christianity, and to a lesser extent Islam and Judaism, represent a more and more self-conscious approach towards sacrificial rituals. That essentially you have an attitude that the scapegoat, rather than being the person to blame for all of our problems, is actually an arbitrary victim. that increasingly comes to awareness, and that this alters the consciousness of modernity. Um, I don't know. I find this part of the argument a little bit less convincing, in large part because it's like unabashedly a Western chauvinist argument, and he never really fully grapples with that. Like Girard does pause to kind of like make fun of all of the people that are going to dismiss him out of hand because of his argument smacks of Western chauvinism. And I agree that's like a dumb reason to dismiss him, but he never actually like addresses the substance of that point. He never actually gets around to being like, okay, well, if Christianity inaugurates this new like attitude of humanism, then well, I don't know, like what about all of the societies that don't have a particularly prominent place for Christianity and that are nonetheless, also beneficiaries of this increasing attitude towards humanism? He never addresses like relatively basic points like that. But nonetheless, I would say that his theory is highly, highly, like really good at explaining ancient literature and also some modern literature as well. I was just fucking gobsmacked when my friends have had me like basically they've been giving me like movie assignments, right? And they gave me a movie assignment, this Kurosawa film. I kind of forget what it's called. No, I don't. Rashomon. Rashomon. They made me watch Rashomon. And Rashomon is a movie about some people who meet in a glade and they do some stuff. And they don't all agree on what the stuff is, right? There's certainly some violence. There's a woman that is competed for, and someone is killed. But the details behind all of those interactions are obscured, and they have different versions. And as I watched that movie, it was like, I don't know, it was like a Girardian, it was like Gerard the musical. And I guess that's kind of hard to explain. I should maybe go into that in a little bit more detail because as I've described his theories, Gerard seems like he's mainly interested in ancient peoples and anthropology and explaining the origins of religion, and that's absolutely true. However, his theories also have a lot of implications for literature. He thinks that ancient literature and also modern literature expresses anxieties about the sacrificial, the ritual crisis, and about mimetic violence. And Rashomon is all about mimetic violence and especially mimetic desire. Essentially, what happens is there's competition over this woman, right? And they all, like all three of the stories, center around the way in which someone wants something and someone else decides their desire based on that thing that the other person wants. Like, oh, if you want it, it must be worth wanting. And then there's conflict that happens there. And I think even though it's not really the focus of this book, maybe we should talk about the way that Girard believes that imitation, which is a very deep instinct to his mind in human nature, the way that imitation itself leads to conflict. This one is a little bit less complicated, but I think we should start by talking about the very, very prominent place that imitation has in Girard's theory of human nature. And I think that this is a really good I think this is a really good explanation of how human like beings are. And to a lesser extent, like he doesn't really elucidate this all the way, but I think it could also explain some aspects of like animal nature as well. Because especially at a very young age, I think that babies essentially learn what it's like to be an adult, learn how to be a person by watching their parents and watching the other adults that are around them and just kind of doing their best to just like imitate them. That's certainly how children learn language, and it's certainly how children learn like cultural behaviors. And I totally agree with Gerard that this is like a built-in feature of human nature that is rooted very, very deeply. So the sacrificial crisis then and mimetic violence, it's sort of hitching a ride on this instinct that serves as the kind of cornerstone of human development. Like you can't get rid of the ritual crisis. Human beings can't evolve to not have the ritual crisis because the ritual crisis is based on mimesis. It's based on imitating the people around you. And if human beings stopped imitating other human beings, they would like not be able to speak and stuff. And obviously that would not be a positive evolutionary adaptation. So in a sense, from an evolutionary perspective, the ritual crisis would then be like a necessary part of human beings having this instinct to imitate each other. Okay, so imitation. Girard believes that imitation leads to conflict, and the reason for that is that imitation it's complicated, right? It's sort of like a it's sort of like a two-faced behavior, if that makes sense. It has a good side and it has a negative side. On the one hand, there's this idea that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? When like your younger brother starts to act like you, I'm assuming you're male because I'm a typical male chauvinist. When your younger brother uh, starts to act like you, it's an indication of his profound respect for you. And it's an indication of respect that is deeper than anything that he could like say. The fact that they are acting like you, that they want to be you when they grow up, that is an indication of respect that goes beyond what could ever be expressed verbally. Okay, so that's nice. But when we think about that, we're sort of imagining an unsuccessful imitation, right? We're imagining you're maybe like 16, 17, and your little brother is like 8 years old, right? But let's imagine a situation where the imitation is a little bit more successful, right? Maybe you're 16 and your brother is 14, right? And he imitates you, and at first it's very flattering, but eventually he kind of starts to get better at it, right? He starts to do the types of activities that you do. Like, let's say you're really into chess. He starts doing chess as well. And maybe if he's really good at imitating you, he actually starts to kind of get better at chess than you are. And I think you can see where this is going, right? First of all, it's just fucking annoying. It's really irritating. And maybe Girard would argue that this is like kind of built into our psychology. It's irritating when someone starts to act like you, they start to get into the same things that you're into, but they're kind of like better at it. Like that's just deeply fucking irritating to us. Second of all, in making themselves like you, they are necessarily putting themselves in a position where they are competing for the same resources that you are. Okay? So let's say that it's not just that your brother is really good at chess and he beats you and you find that annoying. Maybe there's like a chess competition coming up, right? And because your brother has made himself like you, you're now in this completely avoidable situation where because you have the same hobby, because you have the same skills, and because he's even, better at it than you are, you guys are going to be competing for first place in this chess competition. And his success necessarily means your failure. So I think that this explains this sort of arc, right? Explains how imitation can start off flattering and quickly become not so flattering and eventually lead to the conflict. Like if the imitation is actually successful, if it goes beyond the point of success to the point where the Gerard calls him the disciple, the like junior partner in this imitation game. If the disciple actually starts to compete with the master, it basically leads to conflict. And I think that we can see this, like, I think this probably rings true to most people who have had like sibling rivalries and sibling conflict. It's all about similar sibling behavior and also competition for limited resources. And yeah, I think it also reflects in literature. Like, as soon as I found out about this stuff, I kind of reread some of the parts of the book of Genesis. And it's often the case that, I mean, Genesis has a repeated motif of basically siblings who hate each other, right? And the problem is competition for similar resources, but also, imitation of one another is necessarily tied up in that. Like, for instance, in the Esau and Jacob story, Jacob steals Esau's blessing by pretending to be Esau. He literally has to like wear like a goat skin because Esau is too hairy, so he can pretend to be Esau better. Anyway, I think you're maybe starting to see how this can be an explanatory force in literature. Girard also uses this theory to explain sort of more nuanced and more complicated, more like modern literature. In particular, he applies it to Dostoevsky, and I wish I had more to say to you about that. But he doesn't really bring up Dostoevsky in this particular book. He kind of saves it for later. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'll come back in a few months to a few years when I've read the Dostoevsky analyses and we can discuss them. But yeah, that's mimetic violence, the sacrificial crisis. That's Rene Girard. That's my like little brief explanation. Um, okay, I'm gonna go through the chapter list real quick and just see if there's any like major stuff that I've missed. The Yeah, I think that's where I'm gonna leave it. Um, there's a lot more to Girardian theory, but I think that's the kernel, right? Like you can apply it to all sorts of different stuff, but I've given you just the sort of like basic set, the explanation of the starting point of Girardian theory, and then it can be applied to all sorts of, it can explain all sorts of things in anthropology and human psychology and literature, and especially ancient literature. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I should give some maybe like concluding remarks, a conclusion here. I find Gerard to be very academically interesting. Reading a few of his books, I've actually started to be like, oh man, this guy is turning into like a little bit of an obsession for me. And yeah, I think I'm gonna probably keep following that and see where it leads me. Gerard eventually applies this to. I mean, it's one of the like how to put this postmodern meta narratives, right? Girard lives after the postmodern event horizon. He's in the presence of the postmodernists who want to sort of dissolve everything in acid. And he has invented this new meta narrative that explains. It's interesting because it almost doesn't. It's a little bit different from other meta narratives, I would say, in that, first of all, it doesn't have a lot of adopters. There's no like Girardian ideology. But second of all, it doesn't really have a lot of like, here's what you should do, right? Like the other meta narratives, they have uh, things at the end, like capitalism, communism, Christianity, whatever. It tells you something that you're supposed to do. Whereas I feel like Girard is more explaining all of the history that has come before us, all of the like the deeper meaning of all of the literature, and the way in which that history and literature points to, and also sort of points, I almost want to say it points around. Like it points to the violence of the mimetic crisis, but it never quite gets there, you know? We have a really hard time directly thinking about the violence of the mimetic crisis. Um, but anyway, it's an interesting meta narrative because it explains all of history before this point. It explains where we're going and the bad things that might happen to us. But it's not really very prescriptive, right? It's like here's a problem. Here's the sort of like root. Here's this sort of like evil thing that is baked into human society and baked into human psychology. And here's maybe some ways to get rid of it, but it does not tell us like what to do after that, which I really appreciate as a meta narrative. It's just like here's a problem, here's like a thing that we can do about it, and once this problem has been cast, like actually, like once we've dealt with mimetic violence, um, there's not like a thing for us to do. Okay, anyway, yeah, I'm having a hard time wrapping up this review. Violence and the Sacred. I give it, I don't know, 5 out of 5. It's great. You should read it if, like me, you are really brain broken and really into like weird, weird, all encompassing like literary theories that also explain ancient history. Okay, bye bye.